Hi, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute or two. We're just going to wait for everyone to join the call. But I'm going to aim to begin around 12:02. Okay, so thank you all for attending. It's very exciting to see so many people in attendance today. This is, for many of you, I hope you know this, the second webinar of the Indigenous Data Management webinar series. My name is Lauren Bosk, and I am a program officer of research partnerships at the University of Winnipeg, and I'll kind of be acting as the coordinator for this talk and kind of facilitating questions. I wanted to start again today by acknowledging that where I am located as an uninvited settler of French and Finnish descent in Winnipeg is on the birthplace and homeland of the Métis Nation, the Chif, and on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Ojibwe, Nahiawak Cree, and Anishinaabe Oji Cree people, and a place of importance for the Oyate, Dakota, and Dene Sulene Dene peoples. This is Treaty 1 territory. I also acknowledge Treaty 3 and the Shoal Lake 40 First Nation area, which is where we get our water supply. Finally, I'd like to remind you of the resource connecting us all today. Approximately 70% of Manitoba's electricity comes from Nelson River in northern Manitoba, located in Treaty 5. I do this acknowledgement to commemorate Indigenous peoples' principal kinship to the land, which has been restricted. The process of land acknowledgements is inspired by the 94 recommended calls to action, which are contained in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada's final report. Land acknowledgements are a necessary first step towards honoring the original occupants of a place, and I encourage all of you to learn about the land that you were situated on. This series is hosted by Kishaadigeh, the Manitoba Network Environment for Indigenous Health Research, or NEAR, based at the University of Winnipeg. Kishaadigeh is funded by the Canadian Institutes for Health Research and aims to upskill research capacity and infrastructure for Indigenous communities and organizations undertaking health research in Manitoba. Kishaadigeh focuses on promoting Indigenous self-determination in research through the development of community-based research lodges in partnership with 5 Manitoba Indigenous organizations: the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat of Manitoba, the Manitoba Association of Friendship Centers, the Manitoba Inuit Association, the Aboriginal Health and Wellness Center, and Fearless R2W. Data, and by extension data management, is really about sharing and protecting stories. Both as an institution and through the NEAR program, we want to support Indigenous community partners to ensure they have full ownership over their own stories and data. This series, which is hosted by Kishaadigeh and supported by SSHRC and the Winnipeg Library, was built with this in mind, and we hope you'll continue to learn alongside us from our presenters throughout this series. So like I said, this is the second in the series, information on upcoming webinars and pre-registration links can all be found under the news section of the NEAR website. And you can see Larissa has dropped the website link in the chat for you to take a look at. And all of the information is also on our social media platforms as well. As you'll see, this live session is recorded and will be made available under resources and webinars of the NEAR website shortly after the presentation. So before we begin, I just want to say a few housekeeping notes. First, there will be a short post-webinar survey. We would really appreciate you taking the time to complete this survey. Alongside the webinar series, we're developing an Indigenous community-based research data management, or RDM, toolkit, which we plan to release next year. The survey will help us inform the development of the toolkit, especially if there are places in the series that we can clarify, expand on, or do better on. Please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A feature at any time or send me a message using the chat function. And following this presentation from Jamie, I'll pose the questions to her to kind of go through and provide some responses. I'll also make sure excuse me, to leave some space for you to gather your thoughts, excuse me, and type out your questions after the presentation. And then finally, excuse me, please sign up for future webinars in the series. Those who attend all 6 of the webinars will receive a certificate of completion for this training. Finally, I am now delighted to introduce Jamie Orr, who is the Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Winnipeg. Jamie joins us for the 2nd webinar. She was our presenter for the first one as well. And she supports researchers at all stages of the research data lifecycle through consultations, events, and training. Her research interests include data management practices, Indigenous data governance, and learner-centered pedagogy in the context of research services. So Jamie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and thanks so much for having me today again. So I'm just going to share my screen. I have some slides to share. And then I'll get right into it. Oops. There we go. Can you see the red slide? Okay, great. So I also wanted to acknowledge that I am a settler joining you today from ancestral lands on which I am an uninvited guest on Treaty 1 territory in the heartland of the Métis people. I am the Research Data Management Librarian at the University of Winnipeg. And as the Research Data Management Librarian, this webinar is presented from the context of Western institutions such as granting agencies and post-secondary institutions like the University of Winnipeg. So I just wanted to provide that context before jumping in. So today's session will focus on research data management. Last time we were talking about more specifically what data or research data is and some sort of considerations around your research data. And today we'll be looking a little bit more broadly at research data management, the cycle of managing your data through the research life cycle. So first I'm going to start by discussing RDM in the context of Indigenous data sovereignty. I'll then provide an overview of what RDM is, a definition, so we can sort of all get on the same page before providing a summary of RDM policy in Canada, including the new tri-agency RDM policy and other funder and publisher, as well as legislative requirements to be aware of in Canada and Manitoba. We'll discuss the research data lifecycle from data collection through storage and sharing in the context of data management plans, along with a resource for creating your own data management plan, or DMP. And finally, we'll discuss data deposit, what it is and options available for you for depositing your data. So research data management is the storage, access, and preservation of data produced from a given investigation. Data management practices covers the entire life cycle of the data, from planning before you even start your research project, through collection to storage, and eventually preserving and sharing, if that's the choice. The concept of RDM may be new to you, but RDM itself is likely not. You likely already carry out research data management activities. For example, managing your data files, storing your data and sharing it with others throughout the research project. These are all activities of research data management. So this presentation is to help you think more deliberately about RDM as a researcher and or organization, and to hone and formalize your practices. I won't go into too much detail here, as the next webinar will cover OCAP principles in more detail. but I wanted to mention them as they're important to consider in the context of research data management. As I mentioned in my last webinar, ownership, control, access, and possession of data are the principles outlined by the First Nations Information Governance Center. Ownership, control, access, and possession describe the necessary elements for First Nations communities to assert their authority over how their information is collected, used, and disseminated. Another global set of principles exists, and that is GIDA from the Global Indigenous Data Alliance. Their principles of collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. Dr. Jennifer Walker, who will be speaking at our next webinar, is a member of this alliance, and I just wanted to mention that. I also mentioned in my webinar last week that thinking about what these principles look like in practice. To me, they look like a deep understanding of the data that you possess, an active decision-making about how to choose to manage it in a way that benefits you and the community from which it came as an Indigenous researcher. So now let's look at the new tri-agency research data management policy. In March 2021, the tri-agencies released the much anticipated research data management policy. The policy has three major requirements. Two of those are requirements of grant recipients. So any researcher in Canada receiving a tri-agency grant will need to comply with this policy. One of those requirements is of institutions administering tri-agency funding. So the University of Winnipeg will be required to comply with this requirement. I'll talk a little bit about each of those requirements next. The data management planning requirement, as I mentioned, is one of two requirements of grant recipients. The policy states, for certain funding opportunities, the agencies will require data management plans, or DMPs, to be submitted to the appropriate agency at the time of application, as outlined in the call for proposals. In these cases, the DMPs will be considered in the adjudication process. A data management plan is a living document that describes how your data will be managed throughout the project. By living document, I mean a document that is not static. It can be amended as needed and when needed throughout the research project, but does describe how the data is managed throughout the research project. This requirement, the tri-agencies have said that they'll identify an initial set of funding opportunities subject to the DMP requirement by spring 2022. And this will be piloted before this date. So something we can kind of look out for if you are applying for tri-agency funding. The second requirement of tri-agency grant recipients is the data deposit requirement. The policy states grant recipients are required to deposit into a digital repository all digital research data, metadata, and code that directly support the research conclusions in journal publications and preprints that arise from this research. Determining what counts as relevant research data and which data should be preserved is often highly contextual and should be guided by disciplinary norms. So if you're working in health research, it would be the norms of health research, for example. The tri-agencies have provided some supplementary material about the requirements, and one of those states that the choice of repository may be guided by disciplinary expectations and the recipient's own judgment, but in all cases, the repository must ensure safe storage, preservation, and curation of data. The deposit must be made by the time of publication. So this aspect or requirement of the policy will be implemented once the tri-agencies have assessed that the research community in Canada is sort of ready for it based on reviewing institutional strategies. So the University of Winnipeg is working on our own institutional strategy. So my guess is in the next 2 to 3 years, we will see this deposit requirement. Although getting ready and thinking ahead about this is well worth your time. Now you may be wondering if I'm working with an Indigenous community and that community would prefer not to share or deposit their data in a data repository. Where am I? What can I do about that? I will demonstrate that the tri-agencies have taken what they call a distinctions-based approach to Indigenous data in this policy, whereby they have made some distinctions around First Nations, Inuit, and Métis data. The agencies stipulate that for research conducted by and with First Nations, Métis, and Inuit communities, DMPs must be co-developed with these communities and should recognize Indigenous data sovereignty and include options for renegotiation of the DMP. So they're recognizing that a data management plan should be co-developed with the community. As for the data deposit requirement, Indigenous communities will guide and ultimately determine how the data are collected, used, and preserved, and have the right to repatriate the data. This could result in exceptions to the data deposit requirement. So I wanted to make sure that we're aware of that exception when thinking, when complying with the tri-agency RDM policy. So there are other requirements beyond the tri-agency research data management policy that researchers and research organizations should be aware of with regards to research data management. Journals and publishers are more and more requiring data deposit upon publication. They often take a leveled approach to data sharing policies, where data sharing is either encouraged, expected, mandated, and sometimes requires peer review. The data itself requires peer review. So I wanted to just highlight a few examples of journals that I came across that have some requirements, or at least encourage data deposit or DMP development in their policy. So we have a few journals from Nature where they are encouraging or requiring data deposit along with the actual publication. I looked at SAGE's qualitative health research. Their policy is more of an encouragement than a requirement. And then a few examples from Wiley, where the British Journal of Social Psychology, for example, expects data sharing, whereas the Geoscience Data Journal mandates data sharing and peer-reviewed data. In addition to funder and publisher requirements, it is also worth mentioning privacy legislation, specifically when research organizations are working with personal health information. Those already doing health research will be well aware of VIA, the Personal Health Information Act, otherwise known as VIA, which is a privacy law that establishes rules for trustees and custodians of personal health information in Manitoba. A more recent development with regards to health research ethics is the new Research Improvements Through Harmonization in Manitoba, or RITHM, a Department of Research Manitoba, one of a local provincial funder, that will consolidate multiple and complex ethics, privacy, and institutional impact ethics processes into one system. As part of RITHM, a new committee has been formed, and that is the Committee for Harmonized Health Impact, Privacy, and Ethics Review, or CHIPR, which is an independent multidisciplinary committee consisting of health professionals, members of the scientific community, and experts in ethics, privacy, and access to data, as well as public representatives. All research that falls under FIA will be reviewed by CHIPR. This is not, I don't believe this is implemented yet, but will be implemented soon. I also wanted to note that CHIPR does not replace the need for or existing processes related to culturally appropriate reviews by Indigenous communities or ethics review boards, including the Health Information Research Governance Committee. It is also my understanding that the Rhythm project team has and will continue to consult with Indigenous research bodies in Manitoba to engage in discussions around the development of routing processes within Chipper for appropriate review of research involving Indigenous communities and populations. Questions within the Chipper application will identify research that needs to be reviewed by Indigenous review committees and communities before it is reviewed by Chipper. All right, so I'd like to talk about data management planning. Whether you're required to or not, it is good practice in research data management to develop a data management plan for your project. A data management plan is a written document that describes the data you expect to acquire or generate during the course of a research project, how you will manage, describe, analyze, and store those data, and what mechanism you will use at the end of your project to share and preserve your data. You can see here on the slide, I've shown a couple times the sort of life cycle of data, data creation and deposit, managing active data, data repositories and archives, so preserving the data, and then data catalogs and registries. I've been using the word data repository, so to encourage data discovery. Portage Network offers the DMP Assistant, a bilingual tool for preparing data management plans, or DMPs. The tool follows best practices in data stewardship and walks researchers step by step through key questions about data management, from data collection through ethics and legal compliance. So what I wanted to do is provide a bit of a demo of DMP Assistant so that you can actually see what it looks like. So I'm going to actually stop sharing and then reshare my screen. Okay, and you should see DMP Assistant in Google search there. All right. So I just searched DMP Assistant, and the link is through Portage Network. That's who has developed this tool. So I'm just going to click on the link. So anyone in Canada can create a DMP Assistant account. I've used my University of Winnipeg email, but any email would be sufficient. And then once you create an account, you are able to create a DMP. So I'm going to start from scratch here and actually create one. So I'll click on Create Plan. And then I've got a title here for Indigenous Research Data Webinar Series Demo Project. I'm going to say this is for a mock project. And I'm going to indicate that I'm outside of the university for this example, so I'm going to choose other organization. If you're working at a university, then your university, for example, the University of Winnipeg might be listed. But if it isn't, then you can simply indicate other organization. Then we have the choice of a template. So a template will be catered to the sort of discipline that you're working in. So for example, we have a whole bunch of options here. One for water quality research, systematic reviews, research in history and humanities. And then for this example, I wanted to use qualitative health sciences research. So I'll show you what I mean by these are sort of catered to the discipline or the specific area of study that you're doing research in. So we can create plan. And then you can provide some additional information if you have a funder, if there's a grant number associated with your grant, project abstract, an ID is assigned either by the funder or an organization. principal investigator, some things like an ORCID ID, which is an open researcher and contributor ID, that not required at all if you don't have one. And then a data contact person, which can be the same as the principal investigator. So I'm just going to save these details. And I can always go back and edit them. And the point of sort of implementing those details is this DMP can be exported and saved and shared with others. So for example, if you're applying for tri-agency funding and a DMP is required, you can use this tool to create your DMP and all the relevant information associated with it. So this is the plan overview. So these are basically questions that you'll be asked about how you are going to manage your data. So we can click on Write Plan or at the top here, either one. And then basically we'll go through each section and answer the questions, as I mentioned, starting with what types of data will you be collecting. I also wanted to point out here on the right that Portage Network has created or has included some guidance. So a little bit more information about each question that may be helpful. Sometimes they've even included resources that are linked out from the tool itself. So for example, this one says, describe all types of data you will collect throughout the research process, with special attention paid to participant-driven data. Will you be using any existing data from external sources or previous research? The guidance indicates if you will be combining original research data with existing or previously used research data, describe those data here. Some information to provide along with that. You'll notice this tab here, comments. This is for if you're collaborating on a DMP, you can share your DMP with internal collaborators, and you can actually add comments that will be shared with your collaborators, but that will not be included in the final product of the DMPs. This is sort of for if you have questions, if you're unsure about anything, if you want to clarify something, you can add that in the comments and then kind of work collaboratively through the DMP that way. All right, so I'm just going to quickly go through these. Some questions I'll highlight. What is the geographic location within the context of the phenomenon? Experience will data will be gathered? What steps will be involved in the data collection process? So you can see it's getting into sort of the really specifics, which is great because it forces you to think about those and answer those before you even start the research. Another one, what software programs will you use to collect the data? And then what file formats will be generated during the data collection phase, with some guidance around examples. So once those are inputted, you can save and then start on the next section. So data analysis, for example. So how will you document the changes you make to your data on a regular basis? Provide a description of how you will track changes made to any data analysis files. Explain, or examples might include any audit trail steps or versioning systems that you follow during the data analysis process. So this forces you to look at tracking those changes to your data. If there are versioning that you'll need to implement to track changes to your data, that kind of thing. Again, a question about the software you'll be using. File formats to save your data in. Coding scheme or methodology you will use to analyze your data. And quality assurance measures that will be implemented to ensure the accuracy and integrity of the data. Of course, you don't need to have answers for all of these. It would be great if you did, or at least were able to sort of explore and start thinking about answers to each of these questions, but this is sort of covering the breadth of information that you would want to include in a DMP. I'm going to go ahead and skip over a few and go to ethical and legal compliance. So how is the informed consent process carried out in your study? Outline information provided in your research ethics board protocol and describe how and when informed consent is collected during the data collection process. Who holds intellectual property rights to your data if that's appropriate or applicable? What ethical guidelines or restraints are applicable to your data? So in this example, describe any ethical concerns that may be associated with the data in this study. For example, if vulnerable and/or Indigenous populations are included as participants, outline specific guidelines that are being followed to protect them, OCAP or community advisory boards, for example. What legal restraints are applicable to your data? What methods will be used to manage the risk or disclosure of participant information? That one being particularly important and relates back to the data security resource I mentioned in the last webinar, thinking about how to protect high-risk data. We can go ahead to data sharing. Who are the likely users, benefiters of your data? So if you're working with an Indigenous community, working with that Indigenous community as being the sort of primary audience or benefiter of the research. What data can and will be shared at the end of the study? What restrictions are placed on your data that would prohibit it from being made publicly available? For example, a community chooses to keep their data within the community and would not like it shared openly. Where will you share your data? And if you have collected restricted data, what steps would someone requesting your data need to follow in order to access it? Finally, what license will apply to your data? So there's, if you're sharing your data or depositing your data in a data repository, you'll most likely be asked to choose a license that will determine the terms under which your data can be shared. So it could be shared openly. It could be shared with a non-commercial license, for example, so that the data can never be used for commercial purposes. It could be shared with a Creative Commons license that requires any users to provide credit to the data creator, that kind of thing. And here's an example of where Portage has included a link to a resource with more information. So once you've gone through all of the questions and answered as much as you can, and like I said, this might be a living document, so you may come back to it throughout the research project. You can share it. You can actually do this before the DMP is complete, but you can share it with collaborators. You can invite collaborators as a co-owner, an editor, or a read-only. And that's via email. You can also set the visibility so that others can take a look at your DMP, or you can keep it private while it's being developed. And then once you're happy with your DMP and you'd like it to download it or export it, then you can download it. You can choose some options for downloading. You can choose the format, and as well as some sort of basic formatting information. So in this example, we have a PDF that would print out with all of the information that I've included in the DMP. So I'm going to actually stop sharing again and go back to my slides. So next I'd like to talk to you about data deposit. Sometimes the language used around research data management can be ambiguous and unclear. So I wanted to provide a few definitions to help demystify this language. What does it actually mean when I say data deposit? Often data sharing, data publication, and data deposit can be used interchangeably, but they don't always mean the same thing. So Portage Network, which is a sort of network organization of RDM experts in Canada, defines data sharing as the action of providing access to research data. This can happen in a number of ways, including through mediated access, data enclaves, a journal website, or depositing data to a trusted repository. Data publication is another term we can hear sometimes, and Nature, the publisher, defines data publication as the process of making information, particularly data generated from research, available to all. Data archiving is the long-term storage of data and methods. In science, publishing and archiving data is important to preserve scientific information for future research. So there is a bit of a differentiation between data deposit or data publication and data archiving. You might deposit your data in a data repository that also archives the data for longer term. So it has archiving infrastructure or long-term archiving infrastructure. And the central sort of feature of the repository is not just on sharing the data with others, but is also on archiving it. The tri-agencies define data deposit as when the research data collected as part of a research project are transferred to a research data repository. So I'm going to go over a few examples of research data repositories, but first we'll talk about what that is. So a research data repository is a technology-based platform that allows for research data to be deposited and described, stored and archived, shared and published, and discovered and reused. There are a couple different kinds of research data repositories. A general repository, such as the Federated Research Data Repository, which collects data from any discipline. So an example, as I mentioned, is the Federated Research Data Repository, which I'll provide a bit of more detail in the next slide. A domain-specific or discipline-specific repository. So I've included, so that would be a repository where it's only accepting health research, for example, or health data, or in climate data, for example. I've included a resource, re3data.org, which is a sort of directory of discipline-specific or domain-specific repositories. And then there can be institutional repositories, which are also often general. So at the University of Winnipeg, we have a forthcoming data repository through Scholars Portal, and it's will be called UWinnipeg Dataverse, and it will accept data from all the disciplines from researchers associated with the University of Winnipeg. We also have WinSpace, which is a institutional repository for research publications and other research outputs. It's not designed specifically for data, so they're slightly different. So I did want to mention the Federated Research Data Repository, or FRDR. It's a federated research data system for researchers to discover and share Canadian research data. I did a look into who can deposit in FRDR. Requests for deposit from other types of Canadian researchers, so for example, government or NGOs who are not sponsored by a faculty member, will be considered on a case-by-case basis for data deposit. So if you are a research organization and you're not sponsored by a Canadian faculty member, but you'd like to deposit data from a research project for archiving and for sharing, then further might be an option for you. As they state, they'll be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So some features of Further, the data is stored on Canadian servers. It supports large file sizes. It's open to all PIs at all Canadian research institutions. It's indexed, so all the data in Further is highly discoverable on platforms like DataSite and Google Data. And a few of the others, I'm not going to actually get into those sort of nitty-gritties, but Further is a sort of robust infrastructure for depositing and sharing your research data. So I've talked about depositing data and sharing data, but there's different ways of sharing data. So I wanted to just provide a bit more detail on that. I also wanted to mention that the Tri-Agency Research Data Management Policy is not an open data requirement, meaning the tri-agencies aren't required or are not requiring research funder recipients to share the data openly. More the focus is on depositing and archiving the data and sharing when appropriate. So what do I mean by sharing? Data may be shared openly, so it is available to the public. It does not require a login or a paywall or any kind of mediation. So you can just click and download the data. Anyone can download the data when it's open. There's also mediated data where mediated data may require a paywall or may require permission from an individual associated with the data for access. So most data repositories allow for mediated deposit, meaning you can deposit the data, and if it won't be shared openly, but if anyone is interested in looking at or downloading the data, they can contact the data contact associated with the data, and they can work out an arrangement. And then embargoed data are data deposited in a repository but are not available for download for a certain period of time. Maybe based on a data sharing agreement or something like that, or perhaps waiting on a manuscript publication or finalizing some detail of the data. So as I mentioned, most data repositories will allow for some kind of data mediation. I think I included here on the slide an example from a journal, Humanities and Social Sciences Communications. Any researcher on the availability of materials any restrictions on the availability of materials or information must be disclosed to the publishing team at the time of submission. Any restrictions must also be disclosed in the submitted manuscript, including details of how readers can obtain materials and information. So this is an example of a publication requiring the researcher to indicate whether the data will be mediated and how so. So that was a lot of information at one time. So I wanted to just sort of recap and think about where to start if you're sort of starting from scratch on some of this. So first would be writing a DMP or data management plan that describes your current or future projects. Another would be considering how you can improve your data management practices so that they are secure, sustainable, and systemized, whether at the research level or at the organization level. This is an old slide, so ignore my third point on there about an RDM survey. But please do take the survey associated with this webinar series. And then you can also email me with questions or to ask for clarification or any support on what I went over today. Okay, I'm not going to show that slide because I've mixed up my slides with the old slides here. But I'll put my email in the chat so everyone can have it. And that actually concludes my presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jamie. I feel like I've attended a number of your webinars, and I feel like I still learn something new every time, which is always great. Um, I I wanted to maybe I'll note as we give some time for everyone to generate some questions, and feel free at any point, everyone, to put those in the chat or into the Q&A function, and I can pass them along to Jamie. But just for everyone, the next webinar will be October 25th from 12 to 1 again, Central Time. And it's going to be with Dr. Jennifer Walker, who will be speaking on the topic of how can research data management be indigenized and decolonized. So it's taking a lot of the kind of basic background information that Jamie has thoughtfully shared for us and kind of taking it to that next step and thinking about how it can be indigenized and decolonized. And as you mentioned, Jamie, she'll be talking about OCAP as well specifically. So please join us for that one. We do have a couple questions. So the first here is, how do data deposit requirements connect with copyright laws? And so the Trish Patrick offers some background. So very specific. She's collecting government reports that a community should have access to but does not. She doesn't have the copyright privileges over the material. So how can she use the systems to organize the material for the community? And how does kind of data embargo and how does copyright fit into this whole conversation?
That's a great question. That might be a good one for me to follow up on, because it might be sort of specific to this case, but I just need a minute to think about it.
Yeah, definitely.
So, yeah. One, copyright considerations are certainly important when you're thinking about sharing the data or depositing the data later. You might not have the copyright to do so. I'm trying to think if there still might be a circumstance in which you're facilitating or sharing sort of a data summary, for example, of the data that you're not able to share directly, but would provide some layer of discovery and context around that data that could be shared in a data repository, for example. But also exploring options around how is that data actually licensed? If you don't have the copyright, for example, but if the data is licensed openly, for example, a lot of Stats Canada data is actually licensed openly, where a data or a researcher might not have the copyright ownership over that data, but they do have the right to download, manipulate, and share the data. Then that might be an option too, is sort of looking into what are the specifics around that actual data that you're working with. But yeah, happy to follow up with Trish on that. I also, that's totally a big topic that kind of deserves its own webinar, which I hope to make available sort of openly at some point.
Absolutely. Another question in the Q&A is that says, Jamie, you've mentioned Indigenous data management or organization. Do you know the name of the group or organization, or were you meaning organization as in the organizing of data?
Oh, I think, so you've mentioned Indigenous data management or organization. Oh, the organizing it.
So not like an official organization, but the like as in near or but the literal organizing of data management or organization kind of thing.
Okay, I'm just a bit unclear on what the question actually is. So when I refer to a research organization, I am talking about like a Indigenous research organization like NEAR. Not sure what the question means, sorry, about organizing of the data, but that's another aspect of research data management for sure.
Yeah, and I think the confusion was just the word organization both means like a grouping of people that come together in a formal said, like organization, and then organize the literal verb organization.
Yes. Yeah.
So yes, yeah.
I can see how it's really confusing. Apologies
Yeah.
if I didn't clarify that.
Yeah, well, and I think, it's one of those things too, that the language of data management planning and organization, right? Like there's so many, the jargon can kind of be a bit overwhelming, as you've mentioned. So it's really good to kind of break it down like this. And so thank you so much for your question.
Yes, thank you.
Another question we have here is whether you know of any templates from Portage or elsewhere for Indigenous research specifically.
That's a really good question. So Portage Network, I've mentioned a few times, they're sort of a network of experts. They're tied now to NGO, which I cannot remember the full name of, but that's the sort of national research governing or organizational body in Canada around research data and research computing. So Portage Network it started work on Indigenous, some guidance around Indigenous research. It's been a slow process because, of course, when you're working with Indigenous communities, the sort of guidance needs to be specific to that community. And so providing some like broad guidance sometimes isn't helpful. And so it's been a slow process for sure. So for example, they will not be developing a DMP, a data management plan template specifically for Indigenous data because they felt like they couldn't sort of express all the details required for that kind of research in a template. But they are developing some separate guidance that will hopefully come out soon for any researchers working with Indigenous communities or Indigenous communities themselves completing research.
No, that sounds great. And yeah, I could definitely, you can start to see the problem with coming up with something generic when, the whole kind of the base part of Indigenous data management really is very community driven, right? And so each community will be able to determine and think through how kind of data in a big picture should be managed and stored, et cetera, and shared. So yeah, that does make sense, but it's promising to hear that there's going to be some guidelines for sure. The last question that I have in the chat right now, and feel free if anyone has any more questions, we still have about 5 to 7 minutes. But the question that I have here is, can data management like this, the practice of data management that you've kind of gone over, be applied to data used by Indigenous communities for reporting to government, for example? Or is it, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, any kind of guidance or practices associated with research data management, if they're helpful to the community to think through reporting to the government, then by all means, that's useful. I haven't explored that sort of side of things, but I can't see why not. That the practices around research data management and thinking through your each aspect of managing the data would be beneficial to government reporting, for example.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. Well, one more question popped into the chat, and it is: do you know of any Indigenous community or community organization who has their own successful research data management systems?
Oh, that's a great question. I wish I had some actual examples to pull on right now, but I don't. I know that they exist. There are some projects that are actively working on data management planning and data management systems that benefit their own community up north and across Canada. I'm trying to think if I can think of the name of any of them, but they certainly do exist. And next time I'll make a list and think through. Maybe even in the toolkit, I'll make a note of this, providing some examples of communities who are already doing this work would be super beneficial, I would think, to anyone else thinking about it.
Absolutely. No, that's a really great idea. And you know, as we said earlier, right, there's going to be a follow-up survey that we hope everyone fills out. And if you do have suggestions of things that can go into this toolkit, that would be amazing and really help guide the creation of it. Are there any final questions? Oh, I see in the Q&A, HIRGC is one.
There we go.
One example. So yeah, we'll maybe I'll drop that in the chat for everyone. Just because the Q&A only shows up for all of us. So this is what was shared in the Q&A as an example. So thank you so much for sharing that. That's really great to know. Okay, so I don't see any other questions, and obviously, as you were saying, Jamie, right, the practice of preparing a data management plan is really going to shift and change based on which communities you may be working with, what your goals are, what your restrictions are for your data, and so I'm sure as people start to create their own plans, that that may be when questions start to come up. So I know that you included your email in the chat, and you've always been so open about being available to chat with people one-on-one. So do you have any final comments that you want to share before we end off for today?
Sure, just thank you so much for having me as part of this webinar series. It's an honor to present alongside the other speakers, and I'm excited for those webinars over the next few months. So thanks so much.
Yeah, me too. And thanks to all of the organizers with Kishaadigeh too for helping us, for helping put this on. Again, a reminder, please fill out the post-webinar survey to help inform the toolkit. And as I mentioned at the beginning, those who attend all 6 of the webinars that are, I guess there's 4 remaining, will receive a certificate of completion for this training. So please, if attend as many as you can or attend all, that would be great. And please join us on October 25th for the next webinar with Dr. Jennifer Walker on the topic of how can research data management be indigenized and decolonized. Thank you again so much for joining, everyone, and we'll see you then.